Hello, everyone. It is a pleasure to welcome you to the Initiative on Cities. Welcome to our home. My name is Catherine Lusk. I serve as the co-director of the initiative. For those who are new to our community, we are a university-wide urban research and policy center, and we create experiential place-based learning opportunities for students. So we were founded 9 years ago by the late Mayor of Boston, Tom Covino, and we really try to touch all parts of the university that have an interest in cities and urban populations. I am not going to do the introductions today. I just want to say thank you to all of you for joining us. If you are new to us, we have a weekly newsletter. We are on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. I think we're trying to cover all of our bases these days. So there's lots of ways to learn about events, internship opportunities for students, grants, and other programs that exist at the IFC. And thank you so much to Max and the Political Science Department for hosting the event today. And with that, I will turn it over to him.
Thank you. I'm Max Palmer. I'm an associate professor of political science here at BU. First, thank you to the IOC for hosting us and organizing all of this. And this is the American Politics Seminar in Political Science Department. We're really excited to have a talk today from Julia Payson. Julia is an assistant professor at the NYU Department of Politics. She's the author of When Cities Lobby, How Local Governments Compete for Power in State Politics. Starting in July, she'll be an assistant professor in the UCLA Department of Political Science. In addition to this book, Julia studies representation, political institutions, and public policy and state and local governments across the United States. We also have with us today Clare Kelly, and Clare is the director of the Department of Intergovernmental Relations for the city of Boston. In this role, she tracks legislation and policy initiatives that concern the city directly, or urban and regional affairs more generally. And she previously served as the executive director of the Environmental League of Massachusetts Action Fund, where she built political power meet the scale and urgency of the region's environmental challenges. We're supposed to have a third panelist today, Jen Covino, and unfortunately she can't join us today because of a medical issue. But my colleague Catherine Einstein, also an assistant professor of political science and a faculty fellow here at the Initiative on Cities, is going to step in with a couple of discussing comments. So first we'll hear from Julia talking about her book, a few comments from Katie, and then some discussion from Claire before we open it up to questions from all of you. So thank you for coming.
Fantastic. Thank you, Max. I'm so sorry. I'm getting over a cold. And so if you have any trouble hearing me in the back, please just give me a wave. And it's really a pleasure to be here to discuss this book because Boston University has some of the leading scholars studying the types of issues that I take up in this scholarship. The motivation from this project really goes back to my time as a graduate student at Stanford. I was driving in my car one day and I heard a local public radio news story about the fact that in this particular year, in 2015, local governments like cities, counties, school districts were collectively spending more money to lobby in Sacramento than any other interest group sector. And I found this really fascinating because as a graduate student in political science, I didn't remember learning about this in my interest group politics classes. You know, you think of big lobbying industries as being things like oil and gas and finance or unions. And I didn't realize that local governments could use their public funding to actually hire lobbyists to help them achieve their advocacy goals. And this is not unique to California. All across the country, we see that local governments of all types are very active in trying to get funding and shape policy, both at the state and at the federal level. And so these patterns really motivated the research in this book. Some of the questions that I set out to answer with this research were when and why do some cities choose to hire lobbyists to represent them in other levels of government? And I'm going to focus specifically on relationships between the city and state, but it sounds like Claire also has her foot in federal advocacy as well, and we can sort of talk about the similarities and differences. How does the ability to pay for lobbyist representation influence policy and politics at the local level? And then what are the broader implications for intergovernmental representation? What does it mean that we can sort of have paid advocacy as being an important part of this linkage? So the main argument in this book is that lobbyists can essentially help local governments bridge what I call representational gaps that sometimes emerge between different levels of government. So if you think about a local government like a city, cities are sort of uniquely dependent on their elected officials in higher level office because they are nested within these legislative districts where they have officials who are supposed to represent them. If you think about other types of organizations that lobby, like corporations can give campaign contributions to whoever they want. It doesn't matter if the legislator is representing, the district in which a corporate headquarters is located. Corporations can also just move to a friendlier place or state or district. Cities are sort of, not stuck, but they are geographically constrained to be within a particular legislative environment, which can be good. It means that they have built-in de facto representation. So the legislators who are elected to represent cities in both the state and the federal levels, they share the same constituents. They are tasked with trying to pass good policies that represent their district interests. They are trying to get money and policy benefits for the cities in their district. But sort of the quality of the relationship between cities and their electeds and different levels of government can really vary. Sometimes you might have, a federal, a state, and a local person who all share the same party. They're friends, they have their phone numbers. You can really sort of rely on the advocacy efforts of your higher level delegation to get you everything you need. Other times you might be a blue city in a southern legislature in the South where you're having Republicans represent you that maybe have very different sort of state interests relative to what your urban constituents want. And I'll sort of talk about other reasons why this quality of vertical representation might vary. But the argument is basically that advocates or lobbyists are really effective at bridging these gaps that can emerge in terms of the de facto representation that cities have. So, there's this potentially positive role for intergovernmental lobbying if we think about it this way. But I also find in my research that these efforts to lobby can be a double-edged sword for local governments. And this is because depending on the types of cities that choose to engage in lobbying, and depending on how effective those efforts are, we might end up seeing sort of the intergovernmental policymaking process end up favoring certain types of cities or certain types of communities over others. We know from interest group literature and political science that it tends to be the priorities of larger and wealthier organizations that end up dictating policy. And so if the same thing is happening in the intergovernmental lobbying sphere, there could be concerns about inequality. And I do find that high income communities are particularly good at hiring lobbyists, and they're very strategic in the way that they lobby, such that they end up getting more funding when they hire lobbyists. So we do see that there are some of these equity concerns. And so the question really is, should we sort of accept some level of potential inequality if it means better representation and more of a voice for all types of communities? It's a double-edged sword. How should we think about this trade-off? And I'll sort of talk about that in the conclusion after presenting a few pieces of evidence from the book. So how did I do this research and sort of answer these questions? All 50 states in the US have lobbying laws that basically require lobbyists to disclose their activity to the secretaries of state. So if you are a paid lobbyist, you have to report this information. Every state, because they have different laws, means that there's no centralized source of this data. So a big data collection effort in this project was going state by state to get these lobbying records to try to identify who is lobbying. In all states, paid professional lobbyists, of course, have to register. And in many states, in-house advocates also have to register. So if you are representing the city of Milwaukee and you're in-house, you're on the staff, if you're spending X percentage of your time lobbying the state government, you still have to disclose that. In Massachusetts, it's a little bit different. Like, I don't think you are registered as a lobbyist, even though you are advocating for local interests. And I have some questions about this. But in general, we definitely know who the paid outside firms are. And in many states, we also know who the in-house folks are. And then armed with this information about which organizations are lobbying, I have, a list of all cities in the country from the Census of Governments. I'm going to be focusing on municipalities that have at least 5,000 residents, But the truth is, this is a story about mid and large cities. Like these are the ones that are really affected by state policy and politics. These are the ones that have the resources to lobby. So, I'll talk about Boston as much as I can. And then once I know sort of which cities are lobbying and when, how much they're spending, I also have information about the demographic, financial, and political characteristics of these cities and of their state and federal legislators. And I can start to paint sort of a picture about what are the dynamics and patterns that emerge. So what I'm going to do is just sort of give a snapshot of the substantive chapters of the book where I give a key finding or two, and then I'm going to pose a question for Claire based on my research. I was hoping that Jen would also be here, but we can have a lively discussion even without her. The second chapter of the book is really just sort of a descriptive overview, trying to document how prevalent is city lobbying. Are they focusing on the state or federal government? What are they lobbying for? Like, who are these people representing lobbyists? And one interesting just anecdote that emerged in doing this research is that cities are often some of the oldest state level lobbyists in the country. One of my favorite examples of early city lobbying was in order to get the Erie Canal built, the New York State Legislature had to give a big influx of cash. It's a huge public works project. And boosters and lobbyists from Rochester and Syracuse and New York were really instrumental in going up to the State House and pressuring state officials to pass this policy and release these funds to build this canal. So this was sort of one of the first big examples of city lobbying that I found. And we also know that cities were very active lobbying to get railroads to come to town. So as the country was sort of industrializing and forming in the 1800s, we already have informal examples of what would later become city lobbying. Today, again, the way that I'm thinking about lobbying is, are you hiring or paying a lobbyist to advocate for you in other levels of government such that you have to disclose this information? And this is looking at just the total number of cities across the country that are filing these lobbying disclosure records at either the federal or the state level. And you can see this dark solid line at the top records instances of lobbying the state government. And this is much more common than lobbying the federal government because states have a huge amount of power over cities. Cities are creatures of the state. They have to comply with state laws. They're very dependent on states for funding. So it sort of makes sense from an incentives perspective that cities would focus a lot of their efforts at the state level. This little spike in federal lobbying in 2009 and 10 corresponds with the stimulus. It's the American Relief Package. This is when a lot of federal money was released to try to address the housing crisis. And anytime you see a pot of money being released in any level of government, you tend to see local governments arming themselves with lobbyists to try to compete for that funding. There were sort of three main types of lobbying by cities that I discovered as I was doing this research. The most common is legislative lobbying. So just supporting and opposing specific bills that would affect city or local interests. Legislative lobbying can also include targeting the budget. One of the biggest things that legislators do each year in the State House is sign the governor's budget. And they also are very active in appropriations. And cities always want to try to maximize their slice of the pie. So they're extremely active in trying to lobby on the content of budgets, and they're trying to get their state representatives to get them appropriations. Similarly, earmarks are, measures that legislators can insert in bills to try to get extra funding for their districts. And cities really like earmarks and are often trying to convince their elected lawmakers to put those types of things in bills. In addition to lobbying legislatures and legislators, cities also lobby the executive branch. So this is the governor and all the different state agencies that are responsible for regulating laws. There are often grants that agencies release to local governments, and lobbyists can actually help cities fill out their grant applications and be more competitive for these state grants. And regulations can often strongly shape what cities do. I came from California, again, where things like trying to legalize marijuana have big local impacts in terms of regulating dispensaries and how this product is sold, and cities were really active in trying to lobby on behalf of shaping those regulations. And then finally, there's also a type of lobbying that is not so much about influence, and it's more about just trying to gather information so that cities can be prepared when states are going to screw with them. So, states are always threatening to slash their funding or to sort of pass a new policy that might force cities to adapt their policies in some ways. And mayors and local officials want to be prepared. They want to have that information. And so lobbyists are a great source of information about any potential state action that might require a local response. A few just additional interesting patterns that emerged as I was doing this research. Lobbying is very strongly correlated with city size. The bigger the city, the higher probability that it is hiring a lobbyist or, holding a staff, an in-person staff as part of their city operations. And one interesting thing is some local officials that I talked to sort of said, oh, I don't need to lobby. Like, I'm an effective public official. Like, why would I spend my money on a lobbyist? But all cities are lobbying, at least indirectly, because they are all members of these municipal leagues. And these municipal leagues all have in-house advocates and also contract with private firms to try to sort of advocate for local interests generally. So we see a lot of indirect lobbying via municipal leagues. We can talk about why a city might choose to go it alone versus advocate through a municipal league. And then legislative lobbying turns out to be more common than executive branch lobbying. It really comes down to who are your elected officials in your district, what is going on with the budget. And one question that I am going to pose to Claire that we can talk about during the panel discussion is, in Massachusetts, very few cities actually hire professional lobbyists. Most either have in-staff folks who don't need to register as lobbyists, or they operate through the municipal league, it seems like. And so I'm sort of curious if you have any sense of why this might be the case. And then I'd love to hear, in your role, what are some of your top priorities right now during the current legislative session with Massachusetts? In the third chapter, I sort of developed this argument that one of the big reasons why cities might lobby is when they can't rely on their elected officials in state government. A big goal of lobbying is to try to bridge these representational gaps. And interestingly, this quote is from Clare's equivalent in Milwaukee, Jennifer Beal. She's someone who is in-house in Milwaukee, but once in a while, she will also contract with private lobbyists as well. So just a few interesting patterns to sort of paint this story about lobbyists filling representational gaps. These two figures are showing the probability that cities are lobbying, and this is cities all across the country, all 50 states in my data set. This is showing the probability that they lobby across two different types of representational dynamics. One is that in state houses across the country, many cities are represented by more than one state elected official. I don't know how many delegates are there for the Boston delegation. How many states? 25. 25, right, exactly. So it's not uncommon for cities to be split among many districts, many legislators. And this first panel on the left is showing that the more legislators that you have to deal with and wrangle and communicate with, the higher the probability of lobbying, which kind of makes sense. If lobbyists are trying to help you bridge this communication gap and help get your delegation filled in on your local needs, it sort of makes sense that the more representatives you have to deal with, the higher the incentive to get a lobbying firm to help you with this communication. Another thing I can look at is how ideologically cohesive is that delegation. So I'm assuming the Boston delegation in the Massachusetts State House is all pretty blue, but sometimes some cities, might be represented by a mix of Democrats and Republicans. This is especially common for cities in the South. And so this ideological distance between representatives is sort of a measure of polarization within your delegation. And the higher the level of polarization, the more disagreement among delegates, the higher the probability of lobbying. Again, sort of consistent with this idea that maybe lobbyists are helping to sort of bridge these gaps in formal representation. Another thing that I looked at was the effect of redistricting on the propensity of cities to lobby. So in 2010, after the census, we get new census information, and redistricting happened all across the country, both for congressional districts and state legislative districts. After this process, some cities were redistricted in a way that they got split up from their old delegation and they were divided into more districts. They gained more representatives in the state house. And if we divide cities into those that kept their same number of delegates and sort of kept their district boundaries versus those that were cracked and broken up between more delegates, we see this sharp increase in the probability of lobbying for the cities that were redistricted and have this new representational challenge relative to cities that get to keep their old delegations. So just, again, suggestive evidence that these representational dynamics matter. Some other interesting findings that emerge: cities are more likely to lobby when they're represented by members of the opposite party. So if you're, again, a blue city represented by red Republican legislators, you often hire lobbyists to try to bridge that gap. We see that medium-sized cities are especially the ones who are likely to enter and exit the lobbying arena. So from year to year, they take a look at what their political environment is. They decide, is it worth it for me to lobby or not? Big cities tend to always sort of have a lobbying presence. What they do is they change the amount that they're spending and investing, depending on how complicated their political challenges are. And then the question that I have for Claire is, I've always noticed that Boston City Council, Massachusetts State House, they're right across the street from each other. And I've always thought that this proximity might sort of make access easier. I don't know if this is true, but relative to a huge state where you're trying to, traverse great distances to get to the State House, I'm curious if you think that sort of makes it a little easier to get the attention of your state representatives. In the fourth chapter, I sort of zoom out and I think about things from the state's perspective. So these representational dynamics, may or may not affect all cities, but it is true that there are state level institutions that sort of generally encourage or discourage lobbying by all cities within a state. This figure is showing that in some states, lobbying by local governments is extremely common, where you have more than 50% of cities in your state lobbying. In other states, it's not so common, and cities tend to rely on their municipal leagues, in-house staff, and sort of don't pursue this professional lobbying route. And so this chapter is sort of trying to explain this variation. Why is it that some states just tend to have higher or lower levels of overall city lobbying? One thing that matters a lot is how constrained cities are in their ability to raise revenue. So some states have limitations in place that make it difficult for cities to enact property tax raises at the local level. Property taxes are a really important source of revenue for cities. And if cities can't increase property taxes to get more money to fund local services, they have a big incentive to go to the state to try to get more state funding or to try to lobby on state policies to change this. So if we look at the restrictiveness of property tax limitations, so how difficult is it for cities to generate and raise their own revenue, the stricter the limits, the more limits, the higher the probability of lobbying. And lobbying is less common in states that have no limits. Then you don't need to lobby. You can just raise your own taxes, change your own policy. You're not so dependent on the state. And speaking of sort of dependence, cities vary in what proportion of their budget comes from state revenue and state transfers. This panel on the left is showing the likelihood of cities, or the percentage of cities lobbying in a state based on how dependent cities are on state transfers. And as cities become more dependent on state transfers as a proportion of their budgets, they become more likely to lobby. And this is true both across states. It's also true that within states, from year to year, as budget fluctuations happen, if the same state one year is providing more money to cities versus less money, we see the exact same pattern. So if in Massachusetts, funding increases from 0 to 2.5%, we see an increase in lobbying. So cities are very sensitive to the funding decisions of state government. They are responding to the amount available by lobbying. So a few more patterns. I think I'm gonna sort of skip this in the interest of time. The question that I had for Claire was, how important are municipal leagues and sort of informal lobbying in Massachusetts? Because my intuition is it's a small state, it's a blue state. Maybe you can sort of get most of your needs met through this channel versus hiring professional lobbyists. And maybe that's why Massachusetts was one of the lighter colored states on that figure that I showed. So this is the last substantive chapter, and then I'll talk about the conclusion. But I've showed evidence that cities are responding to state politics. They're using lobbyists to address representational needs. What are they actually getting when they hire these lobbyists? Is lobbying a good investment for cities? So it turns out that when cities hire lobbyists, they do secure more money from the state. This analysis is looking at all cities in the country, and it's looking at a set of cities that started lobbying in 2012 compared to a control set of cities that didn't lobby at all during this time period. So the cities, the dashed line at the top are the cities that are going to start lobbying in 2012. The solid line is cities that never lobbied during this time. Cities that eventually go on to lobby, they're already getting more money from the state per person on average. This is consistent with the idea that cities that lobby tend to be larger, they have more service needs, they have more residents. But you sort of notice that there's this discontinuous increase after 2012, where the cities who start lobbying in that year are capturing a greater share and more revenue per capita than the cities that aren't lobbying. And I sort of look at the data in a bunch of different ways, and no matter how I slice it, it sort of seems like after cities start lobbying, they're getting more money. So this is interesting, and it sort of seems like lobbying is effective. But the big caveat is that depending on how wealthy the city is, they can expect to get even more money. So this x-axis at the bottom is showing city median income, and then the y-axis is the predicted effect of lobbying on how much state money you're going to get. And you can see as city income rises, as a city becomes more affluent, the returns to lobbying and how much they're getting from the state increases. So the places that are getting the most are, again, I'm going to talk about the California case, but Beverly Hills, Palo Alto, these sort of niche little municipalities that are going to hire fancy boutique lobbyists and sort of engage a really effective strategy, they are essentially getting more money than the less affluent cities that are lobbying. And at least part of this can be explained by the fact that high income cities are lobbying on more bills. So the x-axis, again, is showing the median income of different cities. The y-axis is showing how many bills in a legislative session they're lobbying. This data is just from California because not all states disclose the specific bills that are being lobbied on. And you can see that higher income cities are more likely to lobby on a diverse array of issues. And to sort of understand what are those issues, what are high and low income cities lobbying for, I did some text analysis of all the bills in California and the content of those bills that were being lobbied by either high income cities or low income cities. I'm defining low income cities as being in the bottom third, the bottom tertile of income, and high income cities as being in the top third. This 45-degree line would suggest that high and low income cities are talking about this term in this bill at the same rate. So a term like local, like the #1 term to appear in bills lobbied by cities is local. Cities care about bills that affect local politics, and both high and low income cities are lobbying on bills that mention this term at very high rates and equal rates. When words appear to this side of the line, these are words that are appearing in the bills lobbied by high income cities more than in bills lobbied by low income cities. High income cities are very concerned about paid sick leave for their employees. That sick is for paid sick leave. They care a lot about metering, their parking meters. They care about their parking meters. They care a lot about environmental things. They care about emissions, recreation, stewardship. So a lot of green, sort of eco-friendly things that high income cities are lobbying on. Poor cities, they're more likely to lobby for things like addressing gang violence, anti-discrimination, unemployment, literacy training programs. And an interesting feature of this is often the things that low-income cities are lobbying for, they tend to be very specific to that local community. So if the state were to give them money or pass a policy, the benefits are going to accrue to that local community. Whereas the higher income cities, they're often lobbying for like green policies that might sort of benefit the state as a whole. And so one of the interesting sort of rationales that it seems like state officials are giving for why they pay so much attention to these high income cities is, oh, these high income cities, they have these great shovel ready projects to build green, eco-friendly buildings with low flush toilets and solar panels. And so, these environmental sort of spillover effects seem to sort of perversely be privileging the richer places that can afford to do this and not getting funding to the neighborhoods that need gang violence prevention programs. I think my big question for really the room, I have a theory about this, but I'd love to theory build with you is, if lobbying is so effective at getting funding, the puzzle is why wouldn't all cities lobby? And during the Q&A, I can tell you my perspective on this, but I would love, if anybody else has theories about this, I would love to hear it. I'm going to skip to the conclusion in the interest of time here. One thing that I will mention is that lobbying is becoming more and more important in the Biden era as money from sort of his infrastructure bills and his domestic agenda is being released. So after COVID, cities really lobbied up. This is especially true at the federal level. So the Washington Post last year had this article documenting the highest rate of city and county lobbying, in the last 20 years. This was after the infrastructure bill was passed. There's a huge amount of money available. Cities are clamoring to get a slice, and we see more lobbyist registration than sort of ever before. So some of the key takeaways from this research: political geography is really important. It matters the relationship between cities and their state and federal officials. City leaders are very sensitive to the policy and funding decisions of their electeds in higher level office. When there are sort of gaps that emerge, lobbyists can fill this gap. It is also true that affluent communities are very effective at lobbying. They tend to have very high quality lobbyists represent them, and their lobbying efforts tend to be quite successful. But it is also the case that a lot of the cities who are the most active lobbyists today are these blue cities and red legislatures where they are trying to pass minimum wage laws. They're trying to pass anti-discrimination measures, and they are lobbying against hostile state legislatures that sort of disagree with their constituents. And especially during the Trump era, we really saw cities as being sort of the forefront of the resistance, and city lobbyists and advocates were a really important part of this. And so, this tension here is sort of the fundamental question that I ask in the book, which is, are we willing to accept that certain communities might benefit disproportionately from lobbying if it means granting a stronger voice to cities of all types, including the progressive urban metro areas that served as the face of the resistance to the former Trump administration? From my perspective, I think that cities are already facing many challenges to achieving fair representation in this country. Our federal system and the fact that we have things like gerrymandering and the fact that we have, densely geographically clustered urban voters in certain areas means that cities are always going to be fighting an uphill battle in terms of having enough representation in the state and federal government. Jonathan Roden at Stanford has a great book called Why Cities Lose, if you're interested in this type of pattern. And so, as long as we have this federal system where cities are dependent and constrained by these higher level officials, the incentives to try to advocate for local interests are really baked into the system. And based on all of my interviews and research, it does seem like lobbyists are one of the key tools for cities to get their needs met and try to advocate for local interests in different levels of government. And I think, at the end of the day, it makes no sense to discuss trying to restrict or sort of reform intergovernmental lobbying without looking at the entire lobbying industry, right? We have all sorts of interests out there that are lobbying. Local governments are sort of an important linkage in the intergovernmental system, and the idea that they are representing their constituents. Why would we limit lobbying by these folks and continue to let corporations and other types of special interests sort of lobby unfettered? So I have some additional slides in the appendix that we can maybe get to, but I will end it there in the interest of time. Thank you.
Been joining the panel for a little. So it is such a treat to get to provide comments on Julia's book. I really enjoyed reading it, and it's just a pleasure to have her share her insights at BU. So Dr. Payson's book really fills this important gap in both for policymakers and for academics in our understanding of intergovernmental lobbying. She collects this amazing, ambitious national data set, which just allows her at a basic level for us to understand the prevalence of lobbying, right? How often does it happen? When does it happen? She can tell us about variations in lobbying patterns and help us to understand how city lobbying addresses critical representational challenges, right? And so she finds and presents this really effectively that there are ways in which lobbying can help cities solve challenging representational problems, particularly for these blue cities and red states. But there may also be normatively problematic issues with city lobbying that in particular, this may exacerbate the gap between the haves and the have-nots. And that's actually sort of the first question I have and would love to hear folks talk about in the discussion is sort of how worried should we be about lobbying potentially distorting sort of where federal dollars go and sort of how effective they can be in helping the cities that perhaps most need help. My other questions have to do in sort of different ways with the way that partisan polarization and party organizations may affect lobbying. And so first, starting with partisan polarization, we know, I mean, just from like observing national politics as people who read the news, but also from sort of more rigorous social science research, that partisan polarization has grown tremendously and that local politics has been really affected by this partisan polarization. We have seen these partisan divides filter down to the local level in many places. And so has this increase in partisan polarization, this nationalization of American politics, made lobbying that much more important for sort of solving these representational issues? Obviously, this data set is amazing and you can't get it back decades and decades, so this is more speculative, right? We don't necessarily know what lobbying looked like 40 years ago, but do we think that cities have to lobby more now, in part because of that growth in partisan polarization and that nationalization of party divides down to the local level? My second question is more actually about party organizations. And during your presentation, you talk about Massachusetts in some ways not being a state that necessarily has as active of lobbying in your data. But we are sort of very well known for being like a machine politics state and one with a very strong Democratic Party organization. And so I wonder, in places that have historically had really strong political parties, do they sort of substitute for lobbying in some ways? Do the relationships between people who are part of this very strong Democratic Party in the state of Massachusetts potentially operate a different way? But anyway, thank you so much for this really informative presentation. I'm excited to hear the discussion. So with that, I'll actually sit over here so I don't have to second their discussion.
Thank you. Claire, I'd like to start. If you can tell us a little bit about your job and how you approach it, and then if you may want to touch on a few of Julia's questions before we open things up.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I actually I went to BU, so it's like coming back, which is nice. It's funny, I think if you'd asked me yesterday if I was a professional lobbyist, I would have said no. So I like to think of like our office, we are liaisons and advocates for what we do. So I run a small department. I think it's like 7 of us. So we do the liaisons and advocacy for federal, state, and local government, and sort of other state governments as well. So it just was really interesting to see somebody else talk about all the work we do. And just for some background, so I was actually a professional lobbyist. That's what I would have said I was at the Environmental League of Massachusetts. And before that, worked at a firm mostly doing environmental climate lobbying at the state level. And then actually before that, I did work for Governor Patrick. So I've been on the state side of it in the government affairs office where cities were calling from that side of things. So I've kind of seen all the different sides of this. And I just joined the mayor's office just a little over a year ago. So came into the city a little bit new, and it's been a real learning experience and exciting, and kind of what we've been advocating for and learning. We've also transitioned from one governor to a new governor. So a few things have changed even in that transition and what we're advocating for. So happy to touch on that, because just talking about the
great relationship with the previous governor, but he was a Republican, and now we are with a Democratic governor, so there are some kind of changes in how that goes. But most of our state legislature are all Democrats, so that's sort of a similar thing. So I'm happy to do. I don't know if you want me to go through the questions or happy to kind of open it up.
I'd love to hear a few of your thoughts on whatever jumps out at you from their discussions.
So why? I did not necessarily know that cities went out and hired lobbyists. So I guess one of your questions was around why Massachusetts cities don't hire lobbyists. Like I said, I didn't think of myself as a lobbyist, so I don't know. I mean, I think that there is a real passion, I think, especially in state government, and you're seeing it more on the federal level too, to support cities and towns, not just in Massachusetts, but across the country. I mean, I think people are seeing, even just like our infrastructure falling apart, like we haven't invested in them. What are we going to do? So sort of there is this new kind of element of like, how do we support cities and towns? And that's where really they're helping. The housing crisis is such a big problem, not just in Boston, but across the country. And then, there's also a real partnership around, and I think cities across big cities are really facing a lot of challenges with the, especially the opiate crisis. And, in Boston in particular, we have, around mass and cast, we have a real challenge in sort of housing, but that is not just, it happens to be in the city limits of Boston, but it is not just a Boston issue. I mean, there are people that are coming in from all across the state and honestly from Rhode Island and other states. And so that has to be a partnership between the city and state, both ways of how are we going to solve these problems together. So I think there is more of a partnership than like us just calling every day and saying, give us more money and do things for us. We do, though, utilize, as you mentioned, in Massachusetts, there are two organizations, and Massachusetts, MAPC Association.
Metropolitan area.
Yes. Who I talk to all the time, I just refer them as MAPC and MMA, who represent, MAPC is more metro mayors and MMA is all 351 cities and towns. So we do partner with them on tons of issues, we really, really love working with them. And I do think more cities, probably the smaller cities and towns, especially MMA, rely on that organization. And they arrange for meetings with like the speaker and the Senate president and chair of Ways and Means for everybody to go in. There are a lot of things that we all agree on in terms of funding that the cities need. I do think sometimes Boston actually gets called out. Our challenge is other cities and towns think like, well, Boston gets that, Boston gets this, Boston gets that, like we're different. So there's always a little bit of a balance with other cities, how we do that. But our top issues of advocacy, what you mentioned around how we create funding is a real challenge for Boston and Massachusetts cities. We are not allowed to like create our own funding sources to a certain extent. So our top issue with the State House, and has been honestly for the past few mayors have filed, we call them home rule petitions. And so there are things that a city councilor or the mayor can file that then gets sent up to the State House and needs state legislative approval and the mayor and the governor. The one we are asking for is what we call a transfer fee. So on transactions we're doing over 2 million at 2% transaction fee that would go into a fund in the city to help with the housing crisis. So we are trying to generate our own money to help with the housing crisis. We don't have the power or ability to do that on our own. So I think it's been filed for the past like 6 sessions and hasn't happened. I'm knock on wood, hoping it's going to be our year. We are also, it was in the news a lot the past few months, but we filed a rent stabilization bill. Again, we don't have the power to sort of, I can get into details of rent stabilization, but we want to sort of allow landlords to raise their rent a certain amount. Obviously, as you know, we're in a housing crisis. We think it'll allow more people to stay in the city, but we don't have the power to do that on our own, so we need state approval. We also have a couple of bills that around the MBTA. It's more just, if you've seen Mayor Michelle would talk about this, is like a personal passion for her, but the MBTA is all state controlled. They control everything. We don't actually have the power, and where funding comes from for the MBTA, how it operates, what happens. I always find like with constituents, it's like a challenge because they think we have more power than we do. So one of our asks is honestly to be on the MBTA board. We would just like to have say and power in how the MBTA operates. And then also we have another bill around commuter rail prices for people who live in Boston. And then we also don't have the power. So these are all things we need from the state. We would like to kind of move towards a fossil fuel free building, thanks to BU who's following and being a leader in that in the city. But we have filed a home rule as well to allow, we don't have the power to allow to stop developers from building fossil fuels. So we've asked for to be part of that program that would allow for that. But I think those are all our, and money. I mean, it's always money. We actually sent our budget letter out yesterday to the House and Main side because they're about to come out with their side of the budget. So we've been talking to the governor, House, and we'll start talking to the Senate. You know, we always have a long list of things that we need money for. Housing is probably top of the list. And then we'll go through the earmark process and all of that. And then the proximity of the city hall and state house. I never thought about it being helpful because I always forget like city capitals are not necessarily, you know, where state houses are. And I'm sure for Worcester and Springfield are, you know, Lowell, it's a little more challenging to get to the state house. So that is certainly helpful. And we've been lucky in Boston too. A lot of the state house legislative leadership happened to be in and around Boston, which is, you know, an added bonus too. But it definitely helps if I have to be at the state house. It's like a 5-minute walk. So that's a nice thing. That's the only one that's down. So
that's
other questions or
I'm just going to start with one question, then I'll open it up. So you touched on the MBTA, and oftentimes we hear discussion about competition between either cities within the state or regions of the state. How do you think about cities in Massachusetts being in competition with each other for fixed funds, or at the federal level with other cities across the country?
Yeah, I mean, I do think there is some competition. I mean, everybody wants the most money. I mean, I think that in Boston, you know, because we are such a, you know, I think there's numbers of like how many, you know, there's 700,000 people who live here and reside here, but by day and who travels in are millions more. So what happens here is important for the rest of the state. So I think there is probably a healthy amount of competition in terms of like funding. And I think there are formulas, you know, around how much money we get for bridges or infrastructure or schools that I think sometimes people feel like they're swayed one way. And I would argue sometimes they're swayed the other way. I know even in federal funding, there was a lot of grants coming out for like electric school buses that favored smaller towns. Because it was around percentage of how many electric buses you'd be able to like electrify, and with the same amount of money they could electrify their entire fleet, and with that amount of money we could only do like 10%. So there are just different formulas of how federal and state money come out to where we end up in competition. But I do think there is usually more we agree on in terms of what, especially around policy. There's more we agree on policy, whereas I think in money, it's always a little bit of that. Please give us more. But I think that's the state to federal. I mean, I think that's just kind of always the case.
Any questions? Yeah.
So looking at the different states that do a lot of lobbying and don't, do you think that there's like, it seems like a lot of the older states like Massachusetts like hasn't changed its constitution, right? But like they rewrote it because like the Civil War and stuff in South Carolina. Like, do you think that has a big impact on it? Because it seems like the oldest states are the least lobbying states.
Yeah, that's interesting. The way I had been thinking about it is that the oldest states also tend to be smaller and denser, where, you know, all the cities are sort of located in the same area and can often rely on the municipal leagues. Whereas out west, you have, you know, these big states and, you know, benefits accruing to one area of the state may not spill over. And so there's more of an incentive to need to lobby individually. But this idea that maybe these old states have machine politics and sort of just different channels through which this can happen. You know, I really liked Katie's point that this could be another way through which lobbying might happen. And in different countries outside of the US, this is precisely what happens. You don't have cities formally paying money to lobby in other countries, but you have the patronage networks and you have, you know, parties really matter a lot. So I like this intuition that something about the history of state politics sort of might shape this trajectory. And I did want to quickly address Katie's other questions, which were excellent. One being sort of, how concerned should we be about this bonus that rich cities seem to get? The thing that I come back to is that these cities, high income cities, are already benefited, they're already advantaged in many ways, no matter how you slice it. And say we were to try to just ban, the ability of cities to hire lobbyists, that would still allow cities to have an on-staff person, and the rich cities could afford to do that. I think of something like the SAT as being a test that's supposed to equalize access to education, but rich people can pay for tutors. I just feel like there's always going to be a way for economically advantaged communities, individuals to have an advantage. The nice thing about lobbying is that, first of all, you have to record what you're doing, so it's a little more transparent. If we're concerned about it, let's get data on it and assess, how problematic it is. And it is open to other types of communities. I think it's actually cheaper for a low-income community to hire, a lobbyist for $50,000 a year than it might be to have a staff of 7 people. And so, I think that the key is more transparency, more discussion around formulas. If you want state funding to be fair, set up funding formulas that are fair. Biden has been really good at this in the way that he's made his infrastructure funding available. He's offering free technical assistance to smaller cities that might not be able to hire lobbyists to help with their grants. And you can design grants to go specifically to low-income communities. So to me, the solution, I think, is not to sort of try to limit lobbying. It's an important, a necessary part of the intergovernmental landscape. The key is to try to design policies that don't leave behind, the most vulnerable communities. So that's sort of my take. And yeah, I'd love to hear other questions as well.
I'm curious. I remember many years ago, Mayor Menino saying that he actually always had an easier time working with Republican than Democratic. This is not a comment on Governor Patrick, who you mentioned you work for, but he felt over the years that he had an easier time working with a Republican governor than a Democratic governor, because they needed to compromise. They sort of needed, a Republican governor needed him in a way that potentially a Democratic governor didn't. And so I'm curious if you mentioned, some of the research, this is sort of a question both for Clare going through a political transition, but I'm also curious in your research if you found, not just in redistricting and shifts in the legislature, but if you found when there was a transition between a Republican and Democratic governor, and was there in fact a different degree of lobbying and or transfers dependent on, did Mayor Menino's comments sort of play out across the country, or is that one observation of one politician in one very blue state?
Sure. I found that it was the partisan composition of the legislature that tended to matter a little bit more than the governor, just because the legislature is ultimately the one who is sort of doing a lot of the policies that affect cities. The governors are, of course, important insofar as they also have an active role in the budget and oversee the agencies. But I didn't find huge differences across mobilization with Democratic versus Republican governors. And this could actually speak to the fact that maybe Republican governors aren't so hard to work with, although this just seems crazy to me. I mean, it just seems like, how could your policy views be more similar? So yeah, I would be super curious to hear from Clare on this as well, because I found that it was really partisan dynamics in the legislature, and I can actually return to Katie's question on polarization after we talk about this. But did you have any sense of whether Republican governors are any trickier to work with?
I had heard Mayor Menino say that. I'm familiar with that, and I don't know. I mean, I don't think he's the only person to say that. I mean, I think you could argue that President Biden maybe would have a more challenge. I mean, I don't know. There's and same with the governor and the legislature. They may say they would have liked a Democrat more than a Republican too. But I think that I do, as much as I think that, maybe he had some points, I do think there are probably more shared values that we hope we have with a Democrat
in office, especially when it comes to like, I mean, I'm speaking from Mayor Wu's like big initiatives around Green New Deal and things like that, I don't know. And, Governor Baker actually did quite a bit on environmental and wind and things like that. And I mean, even today, hopefully we're adopting his state stretch codes that he had put out. But it's, and I think that it depends on it's more like how invested they want to be in cities and towns. And I think Republicans in general have always kind of that like old school Republican thought is like government should be, kind of at the local level to a certain extent. Whereas maybe Democrats want to like hold more big policy type things. So that might be more of maybe it's more competition too. I don't know, when you're the same party.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting point, the idea that if you have a Republican governor, but in sort of an otherwise blue state, and if the Republican governor, believes in localism, there could be more just issues that you could sort of barter over and negotiate. You don't always agree, but there's this strong norm of local difference, and they ultimately need the votes of the state broadly, and cities provide a lot of votes. And if Democratic governors are trying to centralize a lot of things, I could actually absolutely see this happen. But I think this is probably for Massachusetts style Republican governors, rather than in these deep red trifecta states where all branches of government are controlled by Republicans. And we do see this weird thing where even though Republicans have traditionally been the party of localism and small government, we're now seeing that this only goes so far. They don't want cities passing higher minimum wages or protecting transgender people. Then the state legislatures in many places are coming in and trying to pass preemption bills that prevent cities from enacting their own policies. And so there's been this weird sort of reversal where now Democrats in certain parts of the country are arguing for decentralization and localism. So I think I can see why Mayor Menino may have said that in the Massachusetts case, and I'd be curious in other states how mayors would think about this.
Hi, I'm Shauna Shaman from Political Science. I'm just visiting from first, but great fun to be here. I love this project. It's terrific.
Thank you.
Such great data. I wanted to add on to Katie's comment and question, and just add an observation from my own work, which is that sometimes when you can see and measure something is when it is like the actual power is being lost, right? That the lobbying, once you can see it and measure it, it might mean that the relationships that used to exist, particularly those party ones, and the tight buddy, the old boys clubs started to disaggregate or fall apart a little bit, that you have to then pay somebody to lobby. Because what you're paying for in a lobbyist, right, if it's not somebody who's on your staff, right, whose job it is to do the liaising, I do think there's a difference. If you're paying for lobbying, generally you're not paying for expertise so much as relationships, right? And if you're paying for relationships, it means you're lacking that. Anyway, you might just go back upstream more to what the cities are lacking.
Yeah, no, this is such a good point, because there was a sense that sort of in the good old days, the state legislatures came from the cities, and like the mayors had the
from down the
exactly, and it was sort of this boys club. It was this network. They're all part of the machine. Like, why would you need to pay for relationships when you could get it, via these informal back channels? And of course, I'm only measuring a very small part of influence, and maybe it's actually the less important part. Maybe these, other forms of advocacy are just as important. What I would assume is that, yes, I completely agree with this sentiment. It is probably something about growing nationalization, growing polarization, growing complexity that means that these old relationships are sort of fraying and falling apart. We've also seen many states adopt term limits where there's much more churn at the state level. And we do see that in state legislatures that are more complicated and that are introducing more bills, and state legislatures that have term limits, local governments have a big incentive to pay for these relationships. And I will just say, it's interesting, every local lobbyist that I talked to, they said exactly this: the service we are offering is our relationship service. And this is why I think there's the propensity to lobby more when an opposite party sort of sweeps in the state legislature. You just don't know these people. You don't have their phone numbers. And so, this is, I'm really interested in sort of the emergence and evolution of professional lobbying versus this old school. And the second book that I want to write would be sort of an American political development book about this. But I think it's a great and well taken point. So thank you.
So yeah, I actually thought it could give you some leverage methodologically, because then if you, you could kind of piece out some hypotheses about where you should see it. If you disaggregated both lobbyists by their liberal or conservative or partisan bents, right? You should see it when there's partisan differences, right? You should see it not in the small cities that can afford it, and not in the big cities, but in the medium-sized, right? If you did disaggregate both the lobbying side and the cities,
I think
and
that's,
start to form the hypotheses that way.
I think that's right. I just want to see if I have a quote here that sort of speaks to this a little bit. Let me see. So, no. Oh, I don't. I had this amazing quote from a person, I think it was actually the Milwaukee person, saying that, because Wisconsin is one of these purpley states that sort of fluctuates between partisan control of Republicans and Democrats. And this Milwaukee lobbyist was basically saying, when we have a big turnover, we rely more on outside lobbyists just to help grease the wheels. And it sort of spoke to this. And then we could get something about the ideology of the lobbyists doing this work. And I think it's great.
Yeah, and then the medium-sized cities in particular.
Yeah. Right. And this is the sweet spot, right? The small cities never lobby. The big cities always, it's the medium cities. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Very good.
Amazing. Thank you.
All right, I have to run.
I was interested in your reference to Dr. Ray's book, Why Cities Lose.
Yes.
That prompts me to ask what we're talking about here is a story about arguing about the slices of the pie, but perhaps the overall pie might actually not be growing, or maybe it is. But in any case, is this about fighting over the fixed distribution of resources, or actually expanding those resources? And sort of relating to that, and I'm sort of interested that we haven't so far mentioned the National League of Cities or US Conference of Mayors. And do those organizations have any impact in the world you're talking about?
Yes, this is a great question, and it's an important one because when I'm trying to estimate the returns to lobbying for cities, it's a dramatically different conclusion we would draw if one city is sort of stealing money from another city versus the entire pie is growing and sort of no one is worse off, but some cities are getting more. I didn't include this figure in this presentation, but I do see some evidence that lobbying by cities actually does sort of grow the size of the pie, at least at the state government level. States spend about 20% of their revenue on transfers to cities to support them. And there's a lot of fluctuation. They can choose to reallocate funding towards local interests. And so I find at least some evidence that the pie is a little fungible and can increase. But I agree, if we focus too much on just narrowly which city is getting what, we miss this question of, are cities getting enough to support their constituents? And I think this is really key and goes to the Rodin Project. The National League of Cities, the US Conference of Mayors, these are the folks who represent cities broadly in DC. And in this book, I just chose to focus at the state level because of this initial pattern that I found where it seemed like state lobbying was more common. But these municipal leagues, I think they face an interesting challenge of trying to represent places as diverse as Phoenix and New York and Boston and Miami. And so I actually think there's some watered down effects of how their advocacy works, because in trying to placate all of their member cities, there's only so many things that all of these cities agree on. To the extent that there are local issues that do have this widespread support, I think the advocacy efforts are extremely effective. But it sort of ends there, where after a certain point, different cities want their own things. And yeah, with the share of the federal pie, I think COVID was an interesting moment because lots of federal funding was released to local governments. Some are actually arguing maybe too much. A lot of it has gone unaccounted for. I think Biden didn't want to run the risk of underfunding and under responding to this issue. But this was a moment where we really saw the size of the pie increase dramatically. I would love to extend my analyses and see when the pie grows dramatically, do we still see these inequality effects that I was detecting, or is that more in a competitive state environment? So yeah, your thoughts are all sort of spot on. Thank you.
Thank you, very interesting.
I'm curious, your thoughts with naturally the cities or the other sort of bigger organizations, how Boston, what value Boston gets out of them.
Yeah, great. We are part of both of them, and so they have conferences every once in a while, and we talk to them pretty often. I will say the one thing I find really helpful with some of them, and maybe there's also I'm trying to remember the name of it. There's a climate mayors group specifically, and again, that's where we're coming from. They do almost like help us navigate where the funding is, because it is so complicated. Like to your point, like there are all these grants, there's ARPA money, there's the Infrastructure Act, like all right, like where is it? What is it for? Do we qualify? Is it small towns? Is it big cities? And they do put together pretty comprehensive, like here's what you can get, here's what you can get. And just kind of that's been a real help in terms of just where is the money. I mean, we do have, just on the federal level, we do have one person on our team whose entire job is just to like research grants, like are we qualified, can we apply, and then working with our teams to fill out the grants, because these grant applications are not simple. I mean, they're very, very complicated, and there's always small things around, are we even going to get it? And that is where I would say the national organizations do really just like more resource technical assistance is a real asset. And then, they do organize, like we do letters sometimes on different issues that we support that gets sent up to either Congress or the White House or whatever it is. But I think that I have personally found the past year the technical assistance is the most helpful thing.
Claire, you mentioned that Boston has to submit a lot of home rule petitions, especially for funding, tax revenue raising. Is there like, what sort of power does Boston have in the relation to the state legislature? And is there sort of animosity between Boston submitting a home rule petition? I think you mentioned one of them you submitted for 6 sessions and it hasn't been approved. Like, can you give us an idea of what that ecosystem sort of is?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a book on this, and maybe on the history of home rule petitions. You might know. I don't know. There is one. It is a long history.
City-bound.
Yeah. Of challenges. I mean, they historically are very hard to get through. Like I think there was a Globe article this past year that someone wrote about because they called me to see, and they pulled every home rule for the past like 5 years, like 10 of them had passed. And that's like not just Boston. I mean, the ones that we get through where we have, when we do city and public-private partnerships, we have to get a few home rules through. But I don't exactly know the reason why. I mean, there are studies on why why it is complicated to get them through. I think there's a feeling in the legislature sometimes of like, well, if we do it for one, then what's going to happen to the other cities and towns? Because specifically on the transfer fee home rule, I think there are 12 other cities that have filed. Some of them Cambridge, Somerville, like the big cities, but then also there's quite a few cities on Cape Cod, just because they are in a huge housing crisis on Cape Cod. And they have many homes that are selling for over $2 million. So they just want that extra revenue to be able to provide housing for people. And I think there's this feeling of like, well, we can't just do it for Boston, then we have to do it for all of them. So it's a great question, and if you solve it, let me know. But it's you may have something to say on Brookline too. But it is a lot of we'll probably file some more, but I think it just gets into and I think there are cities that would hope that we let one go through, maybe one will lead the way and show that it works. But it's just been a historical challenge for years and years for not just Boston, but for many cities.
add on that.
Unless you have a follow-up.
Oh, no, I don't.
I wanted to ask how you think through home rules versus enabling legislation, and whether or not you've got more of a strategy to, whether or not one strategy works better in your estimation, or is it just you follow home rule but then also work on enabling legislation at the same time?
Can you explain the difference?
Yeah,
for everybody?
yeah. So a home rule petition is a piece of legislation that would have to be passed to the city, so the mayor and a council would have to both approve. Can't send up a home rule with only one body of city government. And then home rules petitions only pertain to the city that has filed it. So for instance, the transfer fee and rent control, it's like a home rule we filed, it only pertains to Boston, and we have very specific numbers of what we would like. But then there is enabling legislation that gets filed, but they get filed directly by like a legislator, who then the enabling ones around rent control and rent stabilization and transfer fee it would be like a local option. So they'd say, we're going to pass this, and every city and town can decide if they want to do this. They can put specifics around numbers or leave it open to the city to decide the implementation of that. So those are the two you can go through. And then because the other thing I didn't say on home rule, though, that it becomes challenges, like we're filing home rules saying this is what we want in Boston, but somebody in like Otis, Massachusetts, the state rep has to vote on that for us. Like they don't care about Boston. So you have 300 or 200 legislators who only has, I think it's like 28 people actually represent the city of Boston. So 170 people are voting on something that matters only to the 700,000 residents here. So that it just becomes, that's where I think that the challenge is. So to answer your question, I mean, you have kind of both, I would say. I think it depends on the issue, it depends on the policy, what the who's talking about it, is filing it, in terms of enabling versus home rule. I mean, usually it's better to go both routes and just like see how it goes. I'm sure there are other people from Menino world and others who could answer out when under those regimes. But I mean, another, Mayor Walsh, I think, he came from the legislature. He was a state rep for what, like 20 years, and I think went into mayor, thinking it would be easier. And I don't want to speak for him or anything, but I think it was still challenging for him and his team, even though that was a world he knew really well and had built those 200 relationships. And it's just kind of like that history of Boston politics, maybe.
Yes.
Hi, thank you. I'm Heather Schoenfeld. I'm a sociologist and I study state politics and policy, but just in response to this conversation, so I'm assuming that the people on the other side are lobbyists for developers who are opposing these types of fees or rent control on this. And so I know there's, one of the reasons that people think that cities are more constrained in getting resources from state and federal government is that there's so many different issues that you have to address, and that you might need to address to the state or federal government with your lobbying efforts, whereas like the development companies want, single focus. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to how that plays into your lobbying efforts. There's so many different agencies within the Boston city government. You're the representative for all of them. How does that play out, especially since you have the experience of also just focusing on one issue, having been a lobbyist before? How does that make a difference?
Yeah, that's a great question. You can ask me next year how this goes, but so when I came in, I did look at as most people, but so the legislative session is 2-year session. So it just started this January, will end, end of 2024. So I kind of, in every mayor for whatever many years, filed like a legislative package. So I did pull up some of Menino's and some of Walsh's, and I had someone go through and be like, pull everything and see what passed, just so I have a sense of how this works. So I came back with they filed 70 bills and 1 passed, 3 passed. It was no more than 5, and it was 60 bills. So to give credit, this is a little bit the mayor's idea. I was like, why don't we just file 5? Like, just keep it simple, like focus. The budget's always going to be a big thing, but like, let's be really focused on what our intentions are here. So that's what we did. So we filed, I think, and it ended up like 6 bills. So it's the kind of the ones I just mentioned. So I think that is kind of our hope, that we can remain really focused on what our asks are, and kind of similar to the governor. You know, here are the things we really want to partner on, and the things we need. Because I do find, you know, especially when you're talking to, you know, for instance, like if I'm talking to the chair of the telecommunications committee, he lives in Ashland, you know, he's wonderful, and but it's a different dynamic. Like when we're calling saying we want these bills through, he doesn't represent people in Boston, but being really clear, like we just need these. This is what we need. So that's the approach we've taken. Again, see how next year goes. But it's a great point, and you know, there's arguments either way, I think, on how things go. And I haven't talked to other cities to necessarily know that they did it, because it's just, you know, Massachusetts always unique.
We have time for one last question.
Sorry, my name's Kichibon Karake. I'm a political science and international relations student, and I tend to take like a sort of you know, international focus on these situations. And I guess like one of the things I wanted to know about like sort of like cities, especially, is like when they sort of maybe like sort of like try to like sort of like, I guess, bargain with like state legislatures and stuff, like have you like seen like examples or like situations where, you know, there are maybe like lobbyists or advocates maybe that they set like maybe like international like spaces, or like I guess in the case of like I guess like in the case of like the United States, at least, like you see like cities sort of like, if like particularly like cross-border cities, like they try to like sort of like, hey, we need stuff at the this state level, but we also need like I guess like New York City, for example, like we need maybe like New Jersey, like incur like help, like we need like New York to do this, so we need like New Jersey to like help do this. It's like you tend to see sort of like, particularly like cross-border cities, sort of like they sort of have lobbyists at their state level, but then also sort of pay other lobbyists to lobby at other different states.
It's a great question. I'm going to start by answering it a little sort of obliquely and broadly, and then come back to the real question, because you use the term intergovernmental bargaining, and this is precisely the language. If you study how cities in Latin America or Africa or Europe are trying to, you know, get their needs met, and you read comparative political science books, they talk in the terms of bargaining instead of lobbying. Although in Europe, the EU has a ton of lobbying. So cities do lobby internationally insofar as, you know, there are formal channels of hiring lobbyists to try to get stuff from the EU. And then foreign countries also hire lobbyists to lobby in the US. So if you want to try to, you know, get foreign policy changed in a way that benefits your country, you have to register. For cities trying to lobby both across state lines and internationally, cities are definitely trying to attract investment and residents at a global scale in this global age. You know, the international context matters for cities. I have not found any examples of city advocates who are operating outside the US, although in your intergovernmental liaison role, I'm curious if that ever happens. I think you would be much more equipped to speak to, you know, how do you relate to Connecticut and New York? So I'll sort of pass the ball, but I love this comparative perspective.
Yeah, it's a good question. The only I mean, we do talk to other cities, as I mentioned. There are cities that we work with, like, maybe that's because we always talk about public transit, but you know, like trains. Like I think there there's been a train proposed, was it, it's Montreal, Montreal to Boston, and how we can connect cities and be kind of like sister cities in the economy and what that would look like. So that's like an example of us working in Canada outside. We do actually have it, it doesn't fall under me, but it falls under economic opportunity. We have like a global affairs team that does, I was actually surprised when I started City of how many cities diplomats like come into town. It is like, it feels like weekly. That different cities come in and tour Boston, come into City Hall, meet with various people, and it's usually around economic. So that's why it falls under the economic opportunity office. But you know, there are people who are coming through all the time, just talking about how we can partner together. So there is more global coordination happening, I think, on city levels. I'm sure they go to the State House too, but I'm not as familiar with that.
I'd love to get a New York City lobbyist in here talking about New Jersey sometime.
They have a lot to say.
Well, thank you both so much for being here today. Thank you all for joining me.